When World War II was finally ending, many thought peace was on the way. But as Soviet troops pushed deeper into occupied Poland, something far darker began to emerge behind the fences of Stutthof concentration camp. What the soldiers uncovered there would become some of the most horrifying proof of Nazi crimes ever captured on film. Stutthof was first created in September 1939, only days after Nazi Germany invaded Poland and triggered World War II. At the beginning, the Nazis mainly used Stutthof to imprison Polish civilians they considered dangerous to German control. The Nazis believed educated Polish leaders could organize resistance against occupation, so many were arrested immediately. But as the war expanded across Europe, the camp also expanded. New barracks were built, fences stretched farther outward, and more subcamps appeared across the region. Eventually, the Stutthof camp system included over 100 smaller camps connected to factories, workshops, and forced labor sites. The prisoner population changed over time as well. During the early years, many prisoners were Polish civilians and political prisoners. But later, the number of Jewish prisoners increased dramatically, especially after mass deportations from ghettos and evacuated camps farther east. Prisoners also arrived from Soviet Union, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Germany, Hungary, and several occupied countries. Some had been resistance fighters. Others were simply civilians swept up in Nazi racial policies or mass arrests. Death inside the camp happened in many different ways. Some prisoners slowly starved after months of tiny food rations that were nowhere near enough to keep a human body alive. Others died from typhus outbreaks, tuberculosis, dysentery, and diseases that spread rapidly through overcrowded barracks packed with sick prisoners. Forced labor destroyed thousands more. Prisoners worked long hours in freezing weather, construction sites, workshops, and military production factories, while already severely malnourished. Guards beat prisoners constantly, and executions became common for even small violations. Later in the war, Stutthof also became part of the Nazi extermination system. Some prisoners were murdered in gas chambers using Zyklon B, while others were killed through shootings or lethal injections. For a long time, much of the outside world still didn't fully understand what camps like Stutthof really were. There were rumors, reports from escaped prisoners, and warnings from underground resistance groups. But many people simply could not imagine a government building entire systems designed around industrialized death. Even some Allied leaders struggled to grasp the scale of what was happening deep inside occupied Europe. By 1944 and early 1945, however, Nazi officials understood the truth could not stay hidden forever. Soviet forces were advancing rapidly from the east, and the front lines were getting dangerously close to camps across Poland and the Baltic region. That realization created panic among the SS leadership. Camp officials started burning documents, destroying records, and trying to remove evidence connected to mass killings. But they also faced another problem. Tens of thousands of prisoners were still alive inside the camp system. If Soviet troops arrived and liberated them, those survivors could describe exactly what had happened. So instead of leaving prisoners behind, the Nazis began evacuating camps across the region in what became some of the deadliest forced movements of civilians during World War II. At Stutthof, the evacuations officially began on January 25, 1945. The timing could hardly have been worse. Temperatures were far below freezing, heavy snow covered roads and fields, and many prisoners were already close to death before the marches even started. Large numbers suffered from typhus, tuberculosis, severe malnutrition, infected wounds, and total physical exhaustion after years inside the camp system. Yet the SS guards still forced thousands of prisoners to begin marching through the winter landscape with almost no preparation. Food was nearly non-existent. Clothing offered little protection against the cold. Most prisoners still wore thin striped uniforms and wooden shoes that quickly filled with snow and ice. Some wrapped torn cloth or rags around their feet because their shoes had completely fallen apart. As temperatures dropped lower at night, prisoners slept outdoors, inside barns, or wherever guards temporarily stopped the columns. Many never woke up the next morning. The SS guards drove the prisoner columns forward day and night. Anyone who slowed down too much risked being beaten or shot. Prisoners who collapsed from exhaustion were often killed on the spot because guards refused to stop the march for weak or sick prisoners. Survivors later described roads lined with freezing bodies as the columns continued moving westward. Some prisoners desperately tried supporting elderly relatives, injured friends, or sick family members, but exhaustion eventually overwhelmed entire groups. Around 50,000 prisoners were evacuated from the Stutthof system during those final months of the war. Local civilians in nearby villages sometimes watched the columns pass by. Many people were terrified to interfere because helping prisoners could lead to punishment or execution by German authorities. The situation became even more chaotic as Soviet forces moved closer. Roads across the region filled with retreating German soldiers, military trucks, refugees fleeing combat zones, horses pulling wagons, and prisoner columns from multiple camps. Air attacks added even more panic as aircraft targeted German transportation routes. Many evacuated prisoners from Stutthof and other camps were pushed north toward ports along the Baltic coast. German authorities still hoped they could transport prisoners farther into remaining areas controlled by the collapsing Third Reich. But by spring 1945, Germany's transportation system was falling apart faster than officials could control it. Thousands of Stutthof prisoners were forced onto barges, cargo ships, and passenger vessels under horrific conditions. Many ships carried prisoners packed tightly together below deck without enough ventilation, food, clean water, or medical care. Human waste accumulated rapidly in cramped compartments filled with sick and dying people. For many prisoners, these vessels became floating concentration camps. Some prisoners died from dehydration or illness before the ships even left port. Others froze during cold Baltic nights because they had almost no proper clothing or blankets. Guards often treated prisoners as disposable cargo rather than human beings. Medical care was almost non-existent because German officials were mainly focused on saving military personnel and escaping Soviet forces themselves. One of the worst disasters connected to these evacuations happened in May 1945, with the sinking of the passenger liner involved in the Cap Arcona disaster. The Cap Arcona, along with another ship called the Thielbeck, carried thousands of concentration camp prisoners, including prisoners connected to the Stutthof system and several other camps. British aircraft later attacked the ships in Lübeck Bay because Allied pilots believed the vessels might be transporting fleeing SS officers or German military units trying to escape Norway. The pilots had no idea the ships were filled with concentration camp prisoners. When British rockets and bombs struck the vessels, fires spread rapidly through the ships. Panic exploded below deck as trapped prisoners fought desperately to escape smoke, flames, and flooding compartments. Thousands either drowned in the freezing Baltic water, burned alive inside the ships, or were shot trying to swim ashore. Historians estimate around 7,000 people died in the Cap Arcona disaster alone, making it one of the deadliest maritime disasters in history. Even during the final days of Nazi Germany, mass death continued everywhere around the collapsing camp system. On May 9, 1945, Soviet forces officially liberated the Stutthof concentration camp. By that point, Nazi Germany had already surrendered. Adolf Hitler was dead after committing suicide in Berlin on April 30th, and the Third Reich had completely collapsed. Across Europe, huge crowds filled streets celebrating the end of the war. But inside Stutthof, there were no celebrations waiting for the Soviet soldiers. What they found looked more like the aftermath of a plague than the end of a military conflict. Hundreds of prisoners were still alive inside the camp, but many were barely surviving. Most suffered from extreme malnutrition after years of starvation and abuse. Typhus, dysentery, tuberculosis, and other diseases had spread rapidly through the overcrowded barracks during the final months. Some prisoners were so weak they couldn't stand when the Soviet troops arrived. Others could barely speak because their bodies had been pushed beyond normal human limits. The soldiers also found corpses throughout the campgrounds. Dead bodies lay inside barracks, beside fences, near roads, and in different areas of the camp complex. Crematorium buildings still stood nearby, along with warehouses filled with clothing, shoes, luggage, and personal belongings stolen from prisoners over the years. The entire camp was surrounded by barbed wire fences, guard towers, workshops, barracks, storage buildings, and execution areas, designed specifically to imprison and control massive numbers of people. Many Soviet soldiers entering the camp were already hardened veterans. They'd witnessed burning villages, destroyed cities, massacres, and years of brutal combat across Eastern Europe. But concentration camps represented something different from ordinary wartime destruction. Everything inside Stutthof showed organization and planning. The overcrowded barracks were not accidental. The starvation rations were not accidental. Forced labor, schedules, punishments, executions, and medical neglect had all been built into the system deliberately. The discovery forced many Soviet soldiers to confront the true reality of Nazi concentration camps for the first time. Military photographers and cameramen immediately documented what they found because the evidence was overwhelming. Footage filmed after liberation later became some of the most disturbing material shown anywhere after World War II. The skeletal survivors, piles of corpses, diseased barracks, crematorium facilities, and stolen belongings provided undeniable proof of what had happened inside the camp system. The gas chamber at Stutthof was smaller than the massive killing facilities at Auschwitz, but it still played a role in the Nazi extermination system. Prisoners were murdered there using Zyklon B gas, while others were executed through shootings or lethal injections directly into the heart. Doctors, guards, administrators, and camp officials all participated in different parts of the killing process. The commandant most connected to Stutthof during its early years was Max Pauli, while later leadership included Paul Werner Hoppe. But the cruelty inside the camp went far beyond just a few commanders at the top. Female guards also became notorious for violent treatment of prisoners, especially during the later years of the war when large numbers of women arrived from evacuated camps further east. One of the most infamous female guards was Jenny von der Barkman. Survivors later described her as attractive in appearance, but extremely violent toward prisoners, which led to the nickname, the Beautiful Spectre. Witnesses accused her of beatings, selections, and brutal abuse inside the camp. By the time Soviet forces documented Stutthof in May 1945, the world was finally beginning to see the truth that survivors had tried warning about for years. After liberation, the immediate problem was survival. Many prisoners needed urgent medical care. Soviet medical teams and later Polish authorities attempted to treat survivors suffering from starvation and disease, but conditions were so severe that, even after liberation, some prisoners still died from complications caused by years of abuse. Human bodies can only survive so much. Doctors treating survivors often described extreme emaciation. Some prisoners weighed less than 40 kilograms. Many had severe infections, damaged organs, and psychological trauma from years inside the camp system. And then came the testimonies. Survivors started describing daily life inside Stutthof to investigators, journalists, and war crimes officials. Their accounts revealed the constant brutality of camp life. Prisoners described beatings by guards for tiny mistakes, or sometimes for no reason at all. Roll calls lasted for hours in freezing weather, while sick prisoners collapsed in the snow. Survivors also described selections, executions, and punishments inside the camp. Children were imprisoned there too. Women suffered terribly as well, especially during the final years when large numbers of Jewish women arrived from camps evacuated further east. One horrifying detail discovered after liberation involved human remains used for experiments and processing. Investigators later uncovered evidence that human fat from victims had been processed into soap-like substances at Stutthof under the supervision of certain Nazi personnel. The subject remains historically debated in some details, but evidence presented after the war deeply shocked investigators and the public. As more camps were liberated across Europe, the scale of Nazi crimes became impossible to hide. The Allied powers gathered documents, photographs, camp records, and witness testimony, Film crews documented the camps because officials feared future generations might refuse to believe what had happened. And in some ways, that fear was justified. The crimes were so massive that many people struggled to process them psychologically. Entire families had disappeared. Entire Jewish communities across Europe had been wiped out. Millions of civilians had been murdered in camps, shootings, ghettos, starvation programs, and forced labor systems. Justice would come soon. Allied governments and Polish authorities began massive investigations into crimes committed inside Nazi concentration camps across Europe. As more evidence was collected from liberated camps, it became impossible to deny the scale of the atrocities. Stutthof quickly became one of the major focuses of war crimes prosecutions in post-war Poland because investigators uncovered extensive evidence. The first Stutthof trials began in the city of Gdansk in 1946. Only about a year after the camp was liberated, former guards, capos, administrators, and camp personnel were brought before Polish courts, while survivors described what they had witnessed inside the camp. Many testimonies were deeply disturbing because survivors explained in detail how prisoners were beaten, starved, executed, or worked to death over long periods of time. Prosecutors also presented physical evidence recovered after liberation. Several defendants received death sentences after the courts reviewed the evidence. Jenny Wanda Barkman's case quickly became one of the most talked about parts of the Stutthof prosecutions. In 1946, Barkman was sentenced to death and publicly executed alongside several other former camp staff members. Other guards and officials received prison terms, or execution depending on the crimes prosecutors could prove in court. But despite the trials, many perpetrators were never caught. The end of the war created chaos across Europe, and countless former Nazi personnel just disappeared during the collapse of Germany. Some destroyed records connected to their wartime activities. Others changed their names, blended back into civilian life, or escaped to foreign countries. In the confusion of post-war Europe, tracking every former camp guard, SS officer, or administrator became nearly impossible. What makes the Stutthof story even more remarkable is that investigators continued decades later. Long after most people believed the war crimes era had ended, German prosecutors still pursued surviving former camp personnel connected to the camp system. One major case involved Bruno Day, who had served as an SS guard at Stutthof concentration camp between 1944 and 1945 while still a teenager. In 2020, more than 70 years after the war, a German court convicted him of complicity in thousands of murders connected to the camp. Prosecutors argued that, even though Day was not personally accused of carrying out executions himself, guards stationed at concentration camps still played a direct role in keeping the killing system operating. Survivors and historians pointed out that camps like Stutthof could not function without guards watching prisoners, escorting transports, securing fences, and preventing escapes. During the trial, Day admitted he knew prisoners were being mistreated and killed inside the camp, though he claimed he had little power as a young guard at the time. Another highly publicized case involved Irmgard Fürchner, who worked as secretary to Commandant Paul Werner-Hoppe. Her trial attracted worldwide attention because she was over 90 years old when prosecuted. Investigators argued that even office workers inside concentration camps helped the system function by handling documents, orders, prisoner records, transport lists, and administrative operations connected to mass murder. Prosecutors said the camp system depended not only on armed guards, but also on clerks, typists, and administrators who helped organize daily operations behind the scenes. In 2022, she received a suspended sentence for complicity in killings committed during her time at Stutthof. These late prosecutions showed something important about the Holocaust and concentration camps. Governments considered these crimes so severe that investigations continued nearly 80 years later. The discovery of camps like Stutthof had permanently changed world history because they exposed how modern governments, propaganda systems, bureaucracy, and industrial organization could be turned into tools for systematic mass murder. After the war, The Stutthof site slowly transformed into a memorial and museum. Former barracks, crematorium structures, fences, and watchtowers were preserved so future generations could see what had existed there. Survivors often returned to the camp years later, revisiting places connected to unimaginable trauma. For many survivors, returning was emotionally devastating. Some searched for traces of family members who never came home. Others wanted younger generations to understand what hatred and dictatorship could create when left unchecked. The numbers connected to Stutthof are staggering. Around 110 prisoners passed through the camp system. Roughly 65,000 people died. Thousands perished during death marches and sea evacuations in the final months alone. And yet for decades, Stutthof remained less widely discussed internationally than Auschwitz or some other camps. Part of that happened because the scale of Nazi crimes across Europe was so enormous that public attention focused heavily on the largest extermination centers. But historians later pushed harder to document camps like Stutthof in greater detail. Today, visitors to the Stutthof Museum can still see parts of the original campgrounds near Gdansk. The preserved structures remain chilling because they look so ordinary at first glance. Wooden barracks, wire fences, concrete buildings. That normal appearance makes the history even more disturbing.